I don't say this lightly. Your books fucked with my head a little bit, and went down some serious rabbit holes that some I knew I would be going down from the titles, and then others that was like, oh, we're going this. Okay, hey now, and pretty wild to me. You went through like a massive personal transformation to get you to this point that you're at now. But I don't think you expected to be on the journey that you like where this took you. Am I wrong when I say that?
You are correct. I had no expectation I'd be on the journey. And even when you mentioned maybe the libertarian instinct within me, I used to be completely apolitical. I would even say just non-political because I didn't know anything about politics until 2020, and then I started paying attention. So, so much of what I wrote about, if not all of it, is new stuff relative to where I was 8+ years ago.
Wow. Okay. So you're talking about literally a 180-degree flip.
Yes. 180-degree flip on multiple vectors.
Well, like what kind of vectors?
Let's say the first book, An End to Upside Down Thinking, is spiritual worldview versus more of an atheistic agnostic. I used to be more atheistic agnostic. So that was a massive one. On the political side of it, I had no orientation at all and then built a very strong case for libertarianism. So that I don't even know if you call that 180 because I wasn't even switching from something. And then the Great Reset book as well kind of gets into the politics, and that wasn't something on my radar. The medical paradigm, I mean, I wasn't one who even really looked at alternative health until 8+ years ago. I was much more of a mainstream allopathic person. Maybe I would have been open to it, but I certainly wasn't talking about questioning germ theory and thinking about the role of consciousness. And then the cosmology stuff was completely off my radar. I mean, when I was an undergrad at Princeton, I remember taking classes on physics and astrophysics and being very immersed in the mainstream Big Bang heliocentric cosmology. So yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking, what are the threads that I might have known about prior to writing these books? In my book, An End to the Upside Down Reset, when I talk about psychological biases, I don't know if you remember that chapter, like motivated reasoning and Daniel Kahneman's work. That was actually stuff that I did study in undergrad, so that was not new to me, but I was applying it to political biases. So I'm just thinking on the fly here. Most of what I have written about is a completely new mark, but I do think the essence of who I am now is not that different from who I was before. It's just I approach life really differently.
So then, okay, so if you took 180-degree turns on a lot of things, like what would you say out of this? I mean, look, listen, you're talking about the beautiful thing about these 7 books that you wrote, right? Basically the Upside Down series, right? Is that you could, first of all, the first one, as you mentioned, right, in Upside Down Thinking, talks about consciousness, but it seems like that's something that you repeated, like even in the Upside Down Liberty, for example, you talk quite heavily about going into the theories of consciousness and the paradigm shift that it would cause, which makes sense, right? Because when your entire worldview changes, like your eating habits naturally are going to change, or like your general philosophy on what the government's allowed to tell you to do is naturally going to change, right? You're like, hey, wait a minute, I'm oneness. Why am I taking orders for, right? Like that kind of makes sense to me. What I'm really curious about is when you went through this kind of spider web of these 7 books, like what other than everything, what did you come across where you're playing devil's advocate in a lot of them, to be fair, which is like, I think is really honorable in the way you're doing it. But when you looked into some of these different things, like which one of them just made you go, holy crap, I never would have considered that even any, like these are crackpot lunatics. Like, could you name a few of those?
Yeah, and first, before I answer, I just want to thank you for taking the time to read my books before the interview. I don't know if you're the only one I've interviewed with or one of the only ones who's read everything. So I appreciate these questions a lot. Thank you. But I would say the first paradigm shift I had for An End to Upside Down Thinking, that was the biggest one for me. And because it really relates to what a human being is And I'm like, wait a second, I used to think I was this and I'm not that. I might be something very different. Whoa. And that's why that theme, to me, it has to carry through, whether it's into political topics or cosmological or medical topics. Basically, the fundamental backdrop for what reality is and what a human being is, that has to flow into any topic to some degree. So it's kind of incidental that my first book covered that topic, because when I wrote the first book, I didn't know I was going to write any more. I really didn't. I didn't know it was going to be an upside down series. I mean, to me, that was the book. And I was still working in Silicon Valley at the time. And I just thought, okay, this is a passion project on the side. This is a really important topic. I can't imagine that there would be other paradigm shifts that would be so jarring to me. But to where your question's leading, there were many. I mean, that first one on the nature of consciousness, the idea that consciousness does not come from the brain and that consciousness might be fundamental to reality and that the brain's like an antenna receiver or transducer or filtering mechanism, that was mind-blowing to me. And now I'm sort of numb to it. But then, I mean, the political stuff, that was massive to me. I used to just think, yeah, the government is this entity that is designed to help the public, when I now see it as an entity that's inherently antagonistic to human liberty. I had never considered that. That was just mind-blowing. And then in some ways it was the most disturbing to me, because I knew how upsetting it would be to many people who like me. I didn't feel quite as much that way with my first book. I mean, I did to some degree, where I had one friend in particular, a really smart guy, read the book before it was published, and he said, Mark, you shouldn't do this. I'm telling you this as a friend. Like, this is really crazy stuff you're doing. And I've gotten that a lot. But this political stuff, you get people really angry when you start talking politics.
That's really hate. Like, that's okay. So a lot of people have no idea the extent of the spider web. So let me just try to do the best I can here. Please cut me off at any time and take over, because obviously you know it a little better than I do. But that's crazy to me that politics seems to be the one where you get the most maybe vitriol response. And okay, you're talking about an end to the upside down thinking basically says you're not really a body. Your senses are an illusion. You cover an insane variety of topics that I'll double tap into soon. You go into the upside down medicine, right? An end to upside down medicine. I mean, if someone read RFK's The Real Anthony Fauci, that's like preliminary stuff for that book, right? Just to put it in perspective. An upside down cosmos, right? An upside down liberty, an upside down reset, talking about the WEF. And that's probably I could just, it's wild to me that the politics would be upside down contact. We're talking about aliens and abduction, and right? You're like, why is politics the one that's so?
It's a great question. And I should preface this by saying that the medicine and cosmos books, which in many ways might be the most controversial ultimately, they are newer and they've only been out for, I mean, medicine came out a year ago, Cosmos only a few months. So maybe those will prove to be more, I'll get more upset people. But the politics for me personally, knowing it was published in 2021, and things were crazy, with the lockdowns, and we didn't know what was going to happen with COVID. So I was the most nervous to publish that one, because it felt like the biggest departure for me. And once I got through that hurdle, the others felt more incremental. Not that they weren't difficult, but I do think politics carries something that others don't, because you get people like maybe who were open to my first book, and they might disagree with me on the medicine and the cosmos, but they say, Mark, I at least respect that you're approaching this from a scientific perspective. Whereas the politics stuff, it's like, you're an evil person if you believe these things. That's the mentality that some people carry with it.
That's for sure, right? Especially now, nobody wakes up. Look, listen, guys. Okay, I think America just approved Ukraine attacking Russia inside Russian soil, and then Russia just retaliated like 2.5 hours ago. So nobody goes to sleep thinking like, oh, this is totally normal, right? So it's like one of those times. Obviously, the Middle East is the way it is as well. So I kind of somewhat see it, and especially in 2021. So were you afraid at all to go into the upside down reset?
I've had some fear that comes up with all the books where I'm exposing something. And I try in general, I don't know if you could tell, I'm trying not to single out an individual as having an intent to deceive. Even in the reset book, I make it very clear that you can have people who have a good intent, but their policies are actually harmful, even though they don't intend for it to be that way. So that
And you
yeah.
one thing, not to cut you off. I was gonna say that, and before you finish, you quote a lot of people. Like in every one of the books, it's like riddled with either their own words or the words of someone who has taken a political analysis or even a scientific analysis. Like you really provide a lot of quotes. This is not just random speculation that you're doing in any of the books. And I noticed that. I specifically wrote that down, like, oh my gosh. And I'll talk about some of the science quotes that you quote, and I'll ask about that, I should say, later. But sorry about that. I just have to preface with that.
Yeah,
'Cause
no, I appreciate you saying it. That's an intentional decision on my part, because if I'm going to talk about these subjects, it's not my opinion. I guess that my opinion is in the way that I weave together the quotes and the way I try to create a framework or an argument, where I also try to talk about the counter arguments too. But I'm giving people's words because I'm not an astrophysicist. I'm not a medical doctor. I'm not a PhD neuroscientist. And I'm trying to weave everything together and bring together credible voices. I mean, even in the cosmology book, I'm quoting Einstein and Stephen Hawking and Michio Kaku and talking about, well, they're asking some questions too. They're not so certain about some of these things. Maybe you haven't heard these quotes before to the reader. But so that's almost a defense mechanism too, if I'm going to write about such controversial topics. If people actually take the time to read the books, which I know some people, they often don't. And I know my sales numbers, so I know a lot of people who are commenting often actually haven't read my books, or they might have heard a snippet of something I've said in an interview and they extrapolate. I think if you read the books, I'm trying to be as objective as possible and give you what credible people are saying as much as I can.
And I picked up on that quite quickly, right? And, like this, some of these subjects are nothing new to me, right? So I have like a first edition of Lynn McTaggart's book. I messaged you about that, right? From the Field. Came across that, read it, found Bruce Lipton very early on in his career. I got fortunate enough to have a mother that is a relatively open-minded person, and she was a nurse for 45 years. So I had the privilege of reading, the biology of belief, and then making a deal with my mom and going, I'll read any book you want me to read. Just read this and tell me if it's total nonsense. Just like I don't know the biology enough. Is it total nonsense or is there something there? And she really read it and was like, wait a minute, whoa, right? And she gets to a couple of the parts when he's talking about the Human Genome Project. Some of this now is quite, talked about. But back in the day, right, this is the early 2000s when I was very young, none of this was a thing, right? It wasn't nearly as popular back then. So even like a lot of the scientists that you quote, like a Stuart Hameroff or a Roger Penrose, in physics, I remember when they were nominated for a Nobel Prize in the OR theory, the orchestrated objective reduction theory of consciousness, which is personally my favorite theory of consciousness because it made sense to me. And I'm the one that brought that to my professor. So not everybody is people are really new to this, I guess, but I'm not in that sense. So that when my friend suggested an end to upside down thinking, she ended with, there's actually 7 of them, and his latest book, The Upside Down Cosmos, has really got my head in a twist. And I was like, oh, really? Okay, I want to dive into this, right? Because, I'm not the alien guy. I'm not I love physics and consciousness and these different things. I went to Joe Dispenza's retreat this year in October. Everybody go. I don't have the words to describe it. Anyway, just check it out. It's unbelievable. You will see there's a realism to the power of consciousness when you witness things that you can't explain, right? But I'm not talking about abductions, right? So going through that book for me, I mean, I'm there's a big window there, and I'm looking around a little bit, and it, like I said, I'm amazed that the politics one is the one that's so that's wild to me. I have to ask though, can you explain a little more for me in Upside Down Cosmos, you talked about dark matter, and dark matter makes up 99% of the universe, and it's convenient because the math worked for the heliocentric, right, which is the Earth revolves around the sun and things move forward in the classic universe we know of. And then I always mess this one up. Sorry. Geocentric, right, is more of what was basically theology of the Earth as the center. And the math worked for both of them, but then 99% something was off. And then they discovered this thing called dark matter. What really caught me by surprise is that you quote a lot of current physicists and professors that basically say the conversation, I'm misquoting here, but the conversation of dark matter is done. It doesn't exist. I'm not saying it's flat, but we have to rethink this. What is going on? Can you share that with me?
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up. And I start my Cosmos book with that topic. I think it's one of the biggest points in the whole book and the biggest points in all of science. And I'm actually going to summarize it in a little different way than I did in the book to try to simplify it for you. But let me characterize your question first for the audience that might not be familiar. So according to mainstream physicists, only 4% of the universe is known stuff. 96% is this mystery stuff. Part of it's dark matter, which is like 25-ish% depending on who you talk to, and the rest is dark energy. They don't know what these things are, but they basically have to exist in order to explain mainstream cosmology. That's the first point, and I'm going to go into that in a second. The other point you made is really important too, which blew my mind when I learned about it, which is that the ancient model of the universe was that Earth is at the center. It's called geocentric. And Ptolemy was the ancient person who talked about it, the Ptolemaic model. I remember learning about this in high school, and probably many members of your audience did too. And then Copernicus came along a few hundred years ago and realized, wow, Earth is not at the center. The sun's at the center. That's called heliocentric, sun-centered. And then Galileo looked through his telescope, and that put the nail in the coffin for geocentrism, apparently. As you know, I talked about that a little bit in my earlier books, and just said, this is like a Galilean Copernican level revolution in terms of how we think about consciousness, using it as an analogy, not knowing that there was more to the story, which is that there is something known as a kinematic equivalence, meaning that when you look at the stars or the lights in the sky, the way we observe things could be explained either with geocentrism, Earth at the center, or heliocentrism. They're equivalent. And I quote Stephen Hawking and Einstein and many others who say, look, we actually can't tell the difference. And why have we moved toward this heliocentric, sun-centered paradigm is often a philosophical preference to say, well, Earth shouldn't be special. And I quote a lot of physicists who actually cater their observations to put it into the heliocentric model. And actually, there are a lot of anomalies that challenge the heliocentric model and suggest that geocentrism fits better. But that's one category over here. The dark matter conversation is a little bit different. I mean, it fits into cosmology, and I would say, well, I'll tell you in a second. Here's how I'll summarize it. If we live on a spinning globe, meaning we're moving and it's spherically shaped, basically, you need to have gravity. One example, if we didn't have gravity, the water on Earth would fall off the sphere. It'd fall off into space. In order for gravity to work, we need to have dark matter. This is the big one. Why do you need to have dark matter? What's the connection there? And the history goes something like this, and there are a lot of other pieces to it, but I really want to simplify. Newton's gravity is you drop an apple and it falls to the ground because Earth has a bigger mass than the apple. And Newton's gravity says that mass is attracting mass, that there's some magical force within mass that brings other mass to it. The mass of the Earth is bigger than the apple falls to the Earth. That's Newton's gravity. And some people often talk about it as like law, colloquially. The problem is that it's not comprehensive as a theory because it cannot explain some very basic things, including Mercury's motion around the sun in the sky. So automatically we know gravity's got problems. And if you dig into physics, physicists acknowledge this. So what happened next is that Einstein's general relativity theory basically covered up for gravity. It became Einstein's version of gravity, which is, yeah, the apple's not really falling to the ground because mass attracts mass per se. It's that mass is actually bending and warping space-time, which, by the way, is a very abstract concept, but it's somehow bending and warping space-time, and it's causing all the bodies of the universe to be attracted to each other or not based on their relative masses. Basically, that's Einstein's gravity. Then what happened? 1933, this is how I start my book. Fritz Zwicky is an astronomer looking at the coma cluster of galaxies in the sky, and he finds that the way they're behaving basically violates Einstein's gravity because there needed to be a lot more mass there. It's something like less than 1% of the mass that should have been there was not there. And basically there were two options. You could say we have to rethink all of gravity, going back to Newton and Einstein, or, which is what modern science tends to do in a lot of places, no, we've got to be right about that. So we must just be missing something. There's missing matter. We're going to call it dark matter, and it must be there. And it's become this entire field of study. We're going to try to understand dark matter. It's got to be plugged in. And I'm going to read you a quote. I didn't have this in the book, but I have something similar. There is a astrophysicist named Pavel Krupa, and I'm reading a July 12th, 2022 article. It's available at iai.tv. And the article's titled Dark Matter Does Not Exist, Cosmology's Collective Delusion, written by Pavel Krupa, who's a professor of astrophysics at the University of Bonn in Germany, where he heads the Stellar Populations and Dynamics Research Group. And he's a professor at the Astronomical Institute of Charles University in Prague. This is what he says as the summary of the article. The current cosmological model only works by postulating the existence of dark matter, a substance that has never been detected, but that is supposed to constitute approximately 25% of all the universe. But a simple test suggests that dark matter does not in fact exist. If it did, we would expect lighter galaxies orbiting heavier ones to be slowed down by dark matter particles, but we detect no such slowdown. A host of other observational tests support the conclusion dark matter is not there. The implications of this are nothing short of a revision of Einstein's theory of gravitation. So that's a bombshell, because this is not me talking about it. This is a credible astrophysicist. You can look him up on his Wikipedia page. And in the book, I quote him from a different interview where he's like, look, me and my colleagues have been looking at this for over 2 decades, and we have falsified dark matter by over 5 sigma results, which means like 99.99% confidence. And let's just go back to the chain that I mentioned before. In order to have a spinning ball model, you need to have gravity. In order to have gravity, you need to have dark matter. If dark matter has been falsified, what does that say about our current cosmology? I'm not making any claim about what the correct cosmology is, but what I try to do in this book and what I try to do here is whatever we're being told isn't working.
Do you think it's... So this is what I meant by... Okay, so there's a couple reasons why I wanted to start where I start. You could even double tap on these current books for future books, meaning the Upside Down Liberty could be very easily spun off into the Upside Down Money. No one's told me anything. I'd be shocked if you're not already working on decentralized writing right now. Just throw that out there, right? You could very easily go into the Upside Down History based on the data and the science. You could very easily go into the Upside Down anything you want, cosmology, virology, right? Like, and just keep double tapping on this because they're so related. Did I just hear you correctly? The model of what we envision is just not right. And scientists are saying this across the board, but they're not being heard. And to kind of bring this full circle, because we are relying on common sense, wisdom, and denying what we are seeing and hearing in our own studies and eyes. Am I hearing you correctly?
Yeah, I want to summarize a few things you said. One is that generally what I realize about myself is that I'm challenging everything that we are told is true. If I'm told something is true, whether it's in a political article or a scientific paper or something, I want to know what is the basis for that assumption. And I have seen a split in society where some people love that and other people get very upset. Who are you to ask those questions? Whether it's in medicine, where I've talked to many doctors and I say, do you know the history of virology? Do you know the 1954 Enders and People study that didn't actually isolate a virus, meaning separating it from all other things, which is what you need to have an independent variable to do a scientific study? No, didn't know about that. That was just an assumption embedded into my medical education, right? That's just, these are the sorts of things, but it happens everywhere. I mean, when I talk to people in all these areas, there are a lot of assumptions they haven't looked at because they just assume it's true. So that's what I'm doing across all these areas. And that's why I think there are warning signs, because maybe we live in a world, and I'm approaching this as more and more of just my worldview, where we are in a state of ignorance that's being imposed on us, that I don't understand how it works, but there's some kind of force that doesn't want us to know the truth about many things. And that's why there are warnings, whether it's Great Reset or various cosmology things or medicine, where you get these tags from YouTube or something, because there is something about the very basic nature of the truth about who we are, where we live, and how things work that we're not told about.
Do you think this has anything to do with what more recently Eric Weinstein has been talking about quite a bit, is that there's like, and same with Peter Thiel has been talking about this for a long time, like 0 to 1, right? Like there has been, in very specific select industries, been obscene amounts of progress. But that's about it. Outside of those few industries, the things haven't changed all that much compared to where the models suggested that we would be at. And now Eric is like, why has every single field of science stagnated for the last 60 years? Like, what's going on here? What is that what you're saying? Like, is that related, where he's just smart enough to kind of see these pieces independently, but you dove into these pieces in research mode, and you're both kind of saying like, something's not right here? What is there, things we're not allowed to know? Is there a force behind the scenes? I'm not suggesting anything, but what the heck is going on, kind of thing?
Yeah. I mean, I've heard bits and pieces of what Eric Weinstein says, and maybe he's seeing it just from a different lens, where he's coming to similar conclusions, like we should be making more progress than we are. And for each of these topics, I could give examples as to why I think we're not progressing. Like the dark matter, dark energy issue, when I quote Pavel Krupa in the book, he says, people study these things because that's where you win prizes, and they're spending all this money to find things that may not even be there. Because he was asked in an interview, if you falsify dark matter, why are so many people studying it? And that's a microcosm for what we might have in other areas where we're going down the wrong path, and it's actually being encouraged. And I refer to this in multiple of my books, this notion of a spiritual war. That's the only way that I can actually put the pieces together, that there are forces beyond the human realm, I don't know what it is, that are influencing what goes on here. And there seems to be an active suppression. There's a quote that I give in 2 of the books, in the Reset and the Cosmos, I think. Dr. Mario Beauregard, who's a neuroscientist who studies spiritual phenomena. And he was working at a mainstream institute in Canada, a neurological institute. He was told by the head of the institute, who he would not name in this interview because the person was very prominent, but he said the head of the institute told him, "You will never study spiritual phenomena here as long as I'm living." And he said, this is clearly social engineering. It's dark versus light. And we could apply this to many other areas too that I write about, where there seems to be some kind of active suppression. I don't fully understand the mechanics of it.
So you're seeing this in pretty much with everything. I mean, literally, I'm a nerd, so I really, really like this, but you're seeing this in everything. And people are asking questions all over the board. I mean, clearly the political situation is the way it is because of something like this, where there's an orchestrated, good or bad, green or blue, red, white, green, blue, or orange, like it is what it is, right? But just objectively looking back, you go like, there are things going on, right? And people saying things that even a short while ago, you kind of would be laughed at if you said them, right? I'm really curious. So I just published my last one. The last podcast I published was an interview I did with a woman in 2017. I was teaching in Kabul, a woman who did translation, and that's all I'll say. And I was teaching her English because of her job. And it was in 2017, never published it. And at the time, she had said she could put her face out there. And she had no problems, put my face out there, put my name out there. And I felt the need, as of recent events, to publish it. But I completely no way. There's just no way. I don't know where they are, just to be clear. I have no idea, right? So when at the time, right, it was like, sheesh, at this point, it's like, what, 2017 is almost 7 years ago. It's kind of crazy. Or wait, longer. So anyway, it's just wild to me that you go, like, I'm just teaching English. I'm just curious. I'm interested. I grew up in a very unique environment and with unique friends. My friend group was Arham, Khabib, Maruf, right? Abderrahman. So, like, you can imagine. And now here we are. You're like, oh, this is quite dangerous. I'm doing conversations as well with people and there's a point to this, I promise. I'm having conversations recently with businessmen down in Mexico, right? And, 27 candidates went missing, right? Not too long ago. Wasn't only that I was wrong about that. It wasn't just the presidential election. 27 candidates through all the elections, but still, okay, right? So it's really hard to avoid some of the glaring, basic, obvious questions when those topics come up, even when you're talking about industrial real estate, right? Like, there's a thing there. It sounds to me that you accidentally joined this spiritual war and had no idea what you were getting into.
I think you are right. I didn't consciously know, but based on the way I look at reality, there's probably a part of us that knows. And I would say that we're all in it and we're playing different roles, whether we know it or not, whether we like it or not. I think it's inherent to this reality. And I say this in my books, I don't know what's at stake. Is it, no matter what happens, it's okay in the end? Or is there a lot that's at stake for our individual souls to wake up to this stuff and act accordingly? I'm not sure. But I think it's probably prudent to act as if it matters a lot, because it certainly feels that way for all of us. When we're going through ups and downs in our lives, it feels like it's super important. So I would think that whatever forces are involved are important as well. And just another point that's coming up is that a lot of these paradigms I'm finding, sometimes people have a hard time getting into it because there are so many different threads you have to unwind. It's like, well, if that's not true, then what about this? And what about this? And what about this? With cosmology, it's on a whole new level of things you have to reconsider because it's all of physics and everything. It's not just the shape of Earth. It's, does Earth revolve around the sun? Is Earth one of the other planets, or is Earth unique and not like one of the other planets? Was there a Big Bang? Are we in an expanding universe? That's massive. But the same thing with medicine. Like, when you get into the virus question, well, then how do you, if there's no virus that's been established using the scientific method, meaning maybe a virus doesn't even exist, how do you explain how people got sick? How do you explain the electron microscope things? How do you explain antivirals? And there are explanations for all of this that you can get into. Or same thing with consciousness in the brain. Well, how do you explain these findings in neuroscience if the brain's not producing consciousness? What's going on with all that? It's almost like people's minds just explode when they get into it, and it's too much to handle. And I have a friend of mine, when I wrote my first book, who's a really smart doctor. He was like, Mark, I think you're probably onto something here, but my life is good the way it is, and I don't want to rock the boat, so I'm not going to go down this rabbit hole.
Yeah. Do you blame him?
No. In some ways I don't. From where he's coming from, I don't. Just the way I look at life is that reality is the way it is, whether we like it or not, and we better get used to it. And actually, that was my mindset before I started writing, when I was more of an atheist. I thought life is random and meaningless. We can create meaning, but it's a rationalization. It doesn't matter because we're all going to die. There's no intelligence guiding the universe. It's literally just randomness that we're here. And I said, that's reality, and I have to live with it. And I wasn't going to try to sugarcoat it, even though it's a very nihilistic perspective. Science is telling us this is true. It's true. Religious, spiritual stuff, that's superstition that science has gotten us past. People used to be in the Stone Ages back then, and I have to live with it. But that actually brings me to another important paradigm that I'm now rethinking. I used to view our evolution as sort of a linear path, or maybe not exactly linear, but we're at the pinnacle of civilization now. Whereas I think that probably a lot of knowledge used to exist in the past that's been lost. Maybe get in this realm of the Eric Weinstein quote, like when I look at the physics of the late 1800s, they used to believe in the ether, which is the fifth element that has been talked about in ancient times. The ancient cosmologies were all flat, geocentric, stationary. I mean, getting back to this point of an ether, I mean, that could revolutionize how we think about energy. And like, to go back to Tesla's work, maybe there's free energy. We don't have to rely on so many energy technologies that we have now. But it's all because of interpretations of the 1887 Michelson-Morley study and a study by Airy in 1881, where basically it was interpreted one way, which led physicists to believe the Earth, it moves and the ether does not exist. Whereas you could interpret those studies another way, that actually the ether does exist and that Earth does not move. That's a massive shift that we ended up on. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, that's one of the other things that I noticed, which is why I was so rigid about going through all of these books, is because what you notice very quickly, and also why I mentioned how many quotes you're putting here, is I literally would pause or stop reading, and I would go to my wife and I would be like, wait a minute, like, let me read this to you. I think I'm reading this correctly. And then have her, we'd go through it and be like, because an assumption creates a study, and then there's an assumption on how to interpret the study. And then that's considered the gold standard in the entire field of science, right? Or whatever, right? And oh man, my favorite quote that I am going to steal from you forever is not really a quote, but I'm still going to steal it because it came from your books. And it was the first time. It was just a simple method of thinking. If you have a hypothesis that all swans are white, you do not need to find an entirely new species of swan to disprove that. You need one black swan. And then you have to rationalize why there's one. But the old hypothesis isn't just like, yes, they're all white, but there's this disease that... No, your hypothesis is wrong. And not all swans have to be white because there's a disease. That reframe is the difference between an entire field of science that might possibly not need to exist. Because instead of throwing the hypothesis out and then creating a new hypothesis with the new information, we are interpreting our studies, which lead to the next study with its own fork in the road of interpretation, which leads to the next study of its own, times 100. These are the threads that Mark is talking about. So if you go from study 1 to study 100, you're not 1 degree off of separation at that point. Your entire worldview might not really be the way it is. And I'm not even a scientist. I'm not suggesting any which way. But I can say this caught my attention in a big, big way. And you went to Princeton, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So you went to Princeton, worked in finance, did a little bit of entrepreneurship, right? And you've lived in the real world. You're not a hermit, right? Mm-hmm. You don't like hide. Yeah. Okay. Just wanted to throw that out there. For everyone that doesn't know. But the logic of the way you're thinking, I'm seriously going to steal that quote. Like, it only takes one black swan to disprove the entire hypothesis. Why are we pretending like we haven't found so many of these different black swans? It'd be a disservice not to at least bring it up and ask. This whole conversation of contact. What is what's going on in your perspective?
I'll respond to contact, and then I would love to follow up on the on the black swan, if I could. Is that okay? And then I want to go on to your question because I'm so glad you mentioned it. It's super important. But let me start with contact. I really don't know what's going on with contact. And it's one of the reasons I felt comfortable writing that book, is that looking at the literature, I don't feel like anyone knows what's going on. It's so complex. What we see in the mainstream narrative with these congressional hearings and everything, they're talking about crafts that are doing strange things. Yeah, that's all great, but that is the tip of the iceberg to focus on a physical craft. Really what we're talking about, what's underneath, beyond the tip of the iceberg, is we're dealing with phenomena of consciousness, where people are in other realms dealing with beings that are doing things to them. And I don't understand it. That's all I can tell you. And what I try to do in that book is show there's a wide range of phenomena throughout history that's been written about in different ways, and it's occurring now, whether it's in the UFO phenomenon or people who are having near-death experiences, people doing different psychedelics, people who are channeling. What's happening is there are other energies that seem to exist. Some of them seem to be benevolent on the surface. Others certainly are not, especially when you get into these really dark rituals where it's unspeakable stuff that happens, but it's in order to invoke beings.
That's how NASA was founded.
Unbelievable, right?
Like, that's literally, going back to history, right? Sorry, keep going.
No, yeah, exactly. So these things intertwine. I'm glad you see the connections, which it's like I'm learning the pieces as I go, but they all do connect. Contact it seems central to all of this because it gets to what are potentially our origins. What's the origin of a human being and everything else? and the cosmos and Earth. It could relate to these other energies. And these energies seem to be affecting us. And sometimes it can occur without even our conscious memory of it. Like, so I talk about the screen memory phenomenon, mind-blowing stuff, where the classic example, Mike Cleland has written books on this where he studied the phenomenon. A person will see an owl, for example, on the side of the road. And it could be other animals too. Owls are the most common. Sometimes it's deer and raccoons. And a raccoon, Kerry Mullis, who invented the PCR test, Nobel Prize winner, he had one of these with a raccoon. But in any event, you see an owl on the side of the road, and then all of a sudden you're driving home and it's a few hours later and you're like, what happened? And it's called missing time. And then the person goes to see a hypnotherapist to see, are there memories during this time that I can recover? And the hypnotherapist, when brings the person to a relaxed state and says, hey, I want you to go over to this owl that you saw, like describe the owl to me. And the person says, wait a second, that's not an owl, it's a gray alien. Wait a second. So, okay, if we take these as valid cases and they're happening all over the place, could it be that these beings have an ability to manipulate our consciousness? They can manipulate our memory. They can even manipulate their appearance. It's known as shape-shifting. And this was written about by John Mack, the former head of psychiatry at Harvard, Pulitzer Prize winner. He said the alien beings appear to be consummate shape-shifters, that they know how to manipulate reality so that we don't even know what we're seeing. Once you get into that realm, you don't know to trust your memory. You don't know to trust what you see. This is fundamental stuff that makes it very hard to know what we're dealing with.
I run long distance the other day, and I was just finishing up your contact book. I live in Okinawa, Japan. I live in the far north, in a small village. I'm the white guy. Let's put it that way. And it's right on the ocean. And I run. I don't always run the same path. I mean, there are people, but I love I grew up on a horse farm, so I'm around a lot of farms. And I run almost every day, 10Ks, 15K, 5K, right? Well, while I was finishing up the book, this has never happened, not even once. And I have run more kilometers than days of the last 10 years, literally. And as I'm finishing up the book, a dog runs behind me. And it came up on the side of me, and I noticed it was there, and I literally jumped. And I'm surrounded by farms. And I was like, what in the... I screamed. Not terrified, but I was like, what the heck? One of those things. And then the dog turned around, ran away. Never happened. I've never even seen that dog. I've literally run this same path hundreds of times. And that's never happened even once. Now, that could be a totally random. That could be a total random dog. Now, after reading your book, I'm not going into hypnotherapy. I'll throw that out there. I don't want to know. But that's a true story. That just happened a couple days ago, right? Not that, it was like, what in the world, right? But there does seem to be something going on. And that was one of the books that really did kind of perk up the hair on the back of my neck a little bit. Because I'm not that guy. This ain't the Danny Jones, the Joe Rogan podcast. I'm not that guy. But at the same time, I have followed Stephen Greer you quote him a couple times, but I followed him for a while, enough to know, we're probably not being told everything, but I'm not going to, let it consume my entire life kind of thing, if that makes any sense, right? I've got a wife, I've got a son now, and it's it is what it is. But that dog was weird, and it freaked me out. And it was right after I finished your book, right when I was finishing it. It was, literally one of those things. Was the cosmos kind of along that realm for you? Because that's the same thing. I mean, you pretty explicitly say in your book, I am not saying we live on a flat earth. I am simply saying the models that you envision when I say the solar system, because an image pops into your head when I say the solar system, which is most likely came from media or programming, we'll call it that, is probably wrong. Was that another one that made you go wait a minute? There's something this is okay. No. Sorry. The follow-up question was going to be, did you give your Upside Down medical book, Upside Down Medicine, to doctors? Did you give the Upside Down living and Upside Down thinking? Did you give those to psychologists and therapists? Did you give this to cosmologists? Or are you on your own out here?
Okay. First thing I want to say before I answer that is your experience with the dog, I've just heard from many people who read my books, whether it's Contact or other ones, that strange things start to happen. Like there's an opening in your consciousness that occurs that then seems to open up. It invites in maybe more of the reality. And that's been my experience in life too. I haven't had something like with the dog, but I've had very strange synchronicities. So I just mentioned that in case your audience gets into this stuff. Reality can get weird, and it's probably in a good way ultimately. That's what I think, because it's closer to the truth, but it can get a little weird. I haven't had any abductions. I haven't encountered any beings, nothing like that, even though I wrote about it. So just to be clear. Okay. And I don't want to. I'm not seeking that stuff out. Okay.
By the way, this is the first conversation I do feel the need to say this, because recently I'm noticing a pattern with this podcast that I never expected. I will never kill myself. I'm not suicidal. Mark, how about yourself?
Absolutely not.
Okay. Go ahead.
Yes.
Sorry.
So you asked, did I give the book to people in the field? Yeah, especially when it gets to the technical stuff. I've tried to have experts read it first. So my first book was heavily endorsed by a lot of, I don't like the word expert, but I'll use that word. So Eben Alexander, he's a former Harvard neurosurgeon. Granted, he had a near-death experience and changed his views. But Dr. Dean Radin, Dr. Roger Nelson, Dr. Ed Kelly, a Harvard PhD and neuroscientist at UVA. So I have had a lot of people read the books first, but largely they're people who tend to agree with it. I have a harder time with the mainstream people to actually hook them in early. I think maybe when the book's published, there might be some quote unquote conversions, but I want to mention a few more. My book on liberty gets into Austrian economics, which is a technical field. So I had Dr. Walter Block, who's one of the probably most famous Austrian economists, read those chapters before it was published to make sure I was faithfully representing the stuff. The medicine book was read by Dr. Andrew Kaufman, a medical doctor, and Dr. Mark Bailey in New Zealand, another classically trained doctor, who have gone into this questioning of virology and allopathic medicine, but they were classically trained. So they read it first to make sure I was doing it. And the Cosmos book was read by Stephen A. Young. He wrote a book called A Fool's Wisdom, but he is a high-level physicist, a theoretical physics PhD, who has come out himself in his book, A Fool's Wisdom, saying, look, I was a PhD student. People came to me with flat earth theories, and I said, this is crazy. I'm going to debunk it. I spent years. I wasn't able to. I don't know with 100% certainty what this place is, but I can tell you, I know with 100% certainty what it's not, and it's not a spinning globe. Now, to your broader question of I've since given the books to, let's say, maybe people who haven't gone that far yet. I have, and sometimes people have problems with the books, and sometimes people say, wow, I'm thinking about it differently. And the majority of the people who read the books, I never hear from, so I really don't know.
Is there like it's very clear when someone is giving honest, genuine feedback and criticism to improve the material versus tear down the entire premise, right? Are you getting any like genuine, like, hey, by the way, you misquoted that, you should correct this. I get what you're saying. I don't agree, but it would make a better point if blah. Like, are you getting honest feedback?
Not that much of the honest feedback. A lot of it is basically a rebellion against what I'm saying. I'm thinking of one example. I don't want to name names. My first book, An End to Upside Down Thinking, brilliant psychologist, stopped reading it after chapter 2. I can't continue this. The science you're talking about is all bogus. It's all pseudoscience. And I could tell, and I see this a lot in the critique. I could tell this person hadn't actually studied the data. And I see that a lot with Cosmos too, where they will look at a high level concept and actually not know. So circumnavigation is a great example. Because you'd say, and I want to preface this again, I'm glad you mentioned this, Quinton. My book is not arguing in favor of a particular cosmology. Rather, it is arguing against the current cosmology. And in the book, I do talk about the flat earth alternative because it can explain certain phenomena very well. But as I mentioned in the book, we actually cannot say with any certainty that it's flat or anything because we haven't had an opportunity to explore things below us, within Earth, because of restrictions like the Antarctic Treaty of 1959, which does not allow us to freely and privately explore all of Antarctica. Maybe you can go to certain parts of it. But yeah, that would be like saying, I saw San Francisco and therefore I know all about North America. No, we've got to explore all of it, which we can't do freely and privately. And there are very few people who go what's above us to be able to view from that perspective in terms of digging below us. I mean, the radius of Earth as a sphere is supposed to be 4,000 miles. We've been able to dig down under 8 miles, and then they had to stop drilling. So, look, we don't even know what's going on to create a comprehensive model. But people will sometimes get turned off when you start questioning the spinning globe and say, oh, you're just a flat earther. You can't explain circumnavigation. First of all, they got a lot of things wrong. Number one, I'm not putting forward a positive claim, whereas the spinning globe people are. They're saying it's a spinning globe that emerged after 13.8 billion years of a Big Bang and so forth. But even on a...
Which now is under question, by the way. I don't know if you've seen it. They said it might be significantly older now with the recent telescope. Yeah, they're seeing things that shouldn't be there. And then they're also seeing a lot of things that disappeared. Because when I read the book as well, I was like going into like, should this be updated? Okay.
No, yeah, thank you for saying that. I mean, the Big Bang, to think that we know what happened with certainty 13.8 billion years ago is really a pretty ridiculous idea. And some faraway land. And based on things we're looking at through a telescope, and we're inferring what those things are and the distances and the sizes, there's so many inferences built into that. And we've now built into our thinking when we see a picture from a telescope that those are distant objects light years and light years away, and they're these stars made out of these types of molecules. Whoa, there are a lot of inferences here. But let me go to the topic of circumnavigation, because it's going to bring me back to the black swan stuff too, okay? Because it gets to a thinking process. Circumnavigation, which is you set sail east and you end up in the same point. Yes, we can explain that on a globe. That doesn't mean a globe is true just because you can explain it using the model. You could explain it on a flat framework, which again, we can't have a comprehensive model, but the framework that many people talk about, and there are many ancient maps that describe this, is that there is an ice wall surrounding Earth. So Antarctica is not a continent at the bottom of the ball. It's actually a circular ice wall surrounding a lake, and inside the lake is everything you see on the globe. Put it inside the lake. That's Earth. It's a circle. It's not a three-dimensional sphere. It's a topographical plane. And in the center of the circle is the North Pole. It's magnetic north. There's no South Pole. So anytime you go directly opposed to the center, you're going due south. But you could have circumnavigation in that model, in that framework, because all you would have to do is turn your compass east and keep going east. It would take you on a circle. A circle around the center, that's circumnavigation. Doesn't prove flat Earth, doesn't prove a spinning globe. The point is that many people haven't thought this through. And there are a number of logical fallacies that come into play here. This is so important, not just cosmology, it's everything. And I'm going to start with this one, affirming the consequent. Affirming the consequent. We should all have this branded into our minds. The technical way of saying it is, if P, then Q, Q, therefore P. What do I mean by that? If it rained last night, the grass is wet today. I see that the grass is wet today, therefore it rained. Oh my goodness, this gets us into trouble. Because, yeah, it's true that the model that it rained last night explains wet grass, but there are probably a million other models we could come up with to explain wet grass. Do little children running by and dumping water on the grass, interdimensional aliens popping into our dimension and dumping water on the grass and then popping out. The point is, there are many reasons to explain causality beyond just one model. And the fact that a model works sometimes to explain certain things doesn't mean that it's the correct model. There's a good example of this on the InfoWars, which is Alex Jones's platform. One of his co-hosts, Harrison, did an interview with Austin Whitsitt, who's one of the biggest challengers of the spinning globe model. He has a channel called Whitsitt Gets It, like multi-hour webinars going through a lot of physics, and I quote him in my book. But Austin was debating Harrison, and Harrison was trying to defend the conventional heliocentric Big Bang spherical Earth model. And one of the things that Harrison said was like, look, Austin, there's so many things that we can explain with the heliocentric model. I don't need to go into this flat Earth stuff. I don't need to go and challenge the spinning globe. And where I think he goes wrong, it's affirming the consequent. The fact that a model can explain certain phenomena. Yeah, the spinning globe can explain day-night cycles, but so could a flat model. And maybe even other ones that we don't know. So the fact that a model works sometimes doesn't mean that it's the correct model. So important. And what happens in science and in politics is they say, well, the grass is wet because it rained. Now we're going to build every observation that we now see. Every data point is going to be force fit into the idea that it rained last night. Instead of saying, well, maybe there's another model to explain this stuff. And then this leads us to what you're describing with the black swans. If the model is that all swans are white, that's the theory, all swans are white. If there's a single black swan or non-white colored swan, then the model's wrong because all means all. And what happens is because we start affirming the consequent and get so locked into the belief that it rained last night, there are little anomalies that come up and say, well, yeah, there's this dark matter stuff that needs to be there, but we're just going to plug in dark matter because the model of gravity and the cosmology has to be right because it rained last night, so to speak. And so these anomalies, we're going to sweep to the side and basically rationalize them. And then you end up with a fallacy called the reification fallacy. The reification fallacy is when you basically invent something and keep speaking about it as if it's real, even though it's never been established. So dark matter is an example of a reification fallacy. We keep speaking about it as if it's a true entity. Same thing with dark energy. There's a particle known as an inflaton that was allegedly around at the beginning of the Big Bang to help with inflation. But you have to have an inflaton particle for the Big Bang Theory to exist, so it's sort of plugged in. The virus is a reification fallacy. It has not been established using the scientific method in a much longer conversation, and yet we speak about a virus as if it's the cause of all the observations that we see, meaning a very specific thing, an intracellular parasite, a replication competent one in particular that gets inside of a host cell, very specific definition. And we observe things in medicine and in petri dishes and so forth and test tubes, and we say this was caused by a virus. And we keep speaking about a virus as if it exists, and we end up reifying its existence. So all these logical fallacies lock us into models where we don't even realize how far off track we've gotten, where we've gotten very distant from the actual observations and data, and then we're incapable of absorbing new data properly.
That's kind of what I meant by this, the forks in the road, and a study that is interpreted wrong leads to the next, but it's the gold standard. So of course we have to interpret our second study this way because the first study can't be refuted. And it's just, so reification. This is what, okay, so I want to go a little deeper into more of your thought process, or your newly found thought process of where you are now, right? So like, what do you think is the foundation of the universe at this point?
I go back to my first book. I think consciousness is the foundation. That's the best I can come up with. And I don't say this with certainty because of the logic that Dr. Bernardo Kastrup has most eloquently articulated. And he describes a metaphysics known as analytic idealism. And the reason I like it is that he uses the term parsimonious. That's a term in philosophy, basically where you can use Occam's razor. Like the simplest solution is usually the best one. And the Occam's razor leads us to the idea that consciousness is the foundation of all reality. And I'm not necessarily talking about just Quinton's individual consciousness or Mark's, but some underlying consciousness that Quinton's is a part of, that Mark's is a part of, that everyone's is a part of. Kastrup's analogy is that all of reality could be likened to a stream of water, an infinite stream, where water is like consciousness and each of us is a whirlpool. So that each individual feels like an individual. At one level, you are an individuated whirlpool, but you're also part of the collective consciousness. You're part of the whole stream. And so like that's my basic metaphysics because consciousness is a required phenomenon in order to experience and verify that anything exists. So if we start getting into the materialist or physicalist paradigm of a Big Bang, for example, where there was this billions of years before any consciousness emerged, we actually can't know that's true because you would have needed some consciousness at that time to verify its existence. It's a basic phenomenon. In order to know something exists, you need to register it in your consciousness. Otherwise, it's complete guess. So this idea of a universe independent of an outside consciousness is definitely possible, but it's also completely unverifiable. And you have to have a religious belief, basically, a leap of faith, ironically, because a lot of science is based on the Big Bang and they have this leap of faith built in, that you could never verify anything. You could have inferences because you say, I see lights in the sky and it took a certain amount of time for the light to get to me. No, that's not a direct verification of anything outside consciousness. If you experience it, it's by definition within consciousness. Okay, so that leads to this metaphysics of some kind of consciousness that underlies everything, some kind of intelligence. And then your question leads us to say, what's the nature of that consciousness? And I don't know. I mean, I think we're some manifestation of it. Everything that we seem to call physical in the cosmos, within Earth, what we see in the sky above us. It's a manifestation of consciousness. And what that consciousness is a way more complex question than I could even try to answer. I mean, my books hint at it. It seems that we can infer based on what we experience here, that there's love, there's hatred, there's darkness, there's evil, there's all kinds of things that we observe and experience, which all seem to be part of the underlying consciousness. And there are people who maybe tap into this for split seconds or in a near-death experience or a psychedelic state or meditation or something, spiritually transformative experiences where they say, what I experienced, I could not describe with words. The term is ineffability. And maybe we can learn things from them, but we're going to have distortions because they're using language, and that's going to distort an experience because an experience is subjective. And then when we get into screen memories and the ability to manipulate consciousness, like shape-shifting, how do we even know that maybe they did experience that, but they were being manipulated in their experience, and now they're giving us propaganda because they experience some higher consciousness that's actually not real. So I don't feel prepared to say I know what it is.
Mm. What do you think's going on with this the dude? Hesitant to ask. Anyway, sorry. What did you come to with the study of the Great Reset as well as liberty? What do you now think where we currently are versus what do you think is the best? I think you did say this pretty explicitly in Upside Down Liberty, if I'm not mistaken, but for everyone else.
Yeah, the broader question here that I when I was zooming out, so I got really hooked into the 2020 stuff with the 2020 election and also everything with COVID, because that divided the world. You basically had to have a political opinion. No opinion was an opinion at that point. It was so absurd. And then it was affecting people's health. Like, did you want to wear a mask or not? Did you want to get the jab or not? So like everyone was making decisions that put them in a certain bucket. And initially, I was very much just like resonating toward the people who were advocating for freedom, who were saying you should have a choice with this, and that the media is not telling us the full story with these injections. They're not telling us the full story with even COVID and so forth. So that was leading me very far away from the political left and the Democrats, who tended to be more pro-narrative. But then I was like, what's the correct politics with this stuff? Which then means basically, how should we be structuring society? That's what politics is about. And then I was trying to tie my work on consciousness into it, because the Liberty book is the third one. And that led me to say, well, what is government itself? And who are the thinkers who are challenging the nature of government? And so the Liberty book gives the framework. I'll describe what I would say is maybe the ideal version. And in the book, I'm very clear to say, I don't know if we can get here, but this is at least conceptually ideal. And some people have read that book and they get upset with me. Mark, this is inconceivable. This would never happen. And I'm like, I say in the book, I don't know if this is conceivable, but we have to have a North Star. I don't know how clear I can be, but people selectively read and so forth. That happens. That just goes with the territory. Then the Reset book is basically applying some of the principles in Liberty, and then also looking at sociological trends to say, where are we being steered versus this ideal? And let's go through this. Excuse me. So what is government? I had never thought to ask that. Like I said before, I used to think that government was basically this benevolent entity that's here to help society. But then I started to look at it as a service provider, especially after reading the work of Larkin Rose, who wrote a great book called The Most Dangerous Superstition. And then also the work of Murray Rothbard, Ludwig von Mises, the Mises Institute, which is based in Auburn, Alabama. I've spoken there twice, actually, at the Austrian Economics Research Conference. They're doing amazing work. And on their website at Mises.org, they have a lot of free resources where you can read full books by these amazing people, like PDFs, and some of them are even Audible. Okay, so government as a service provider. That's a different way of looking at it than how I used to look at it. Because I worked, like you said, I worked in the business world. I did investment banking in New York. I was working in Silicon Valley, advising tech companies. Service providers are all over the place. Any business is providing a good or a service to a customer. I was a service provider. I provide advisory services to businesses and inventors that needed support, for example. And what happens often when you have a service provider and a customer is there's a contract between the parties that is mutually agreed upon and signed, where the service provider says, look, these are the things I'm going to do for you. This is how you can terminate. This is the price. It's all laid out very explicitly, and the customer agrees to it. And if the customer makes a mistake and hires the wrong person, like at least they agreed to it beforehand, and maybe they fire that service provider and they hire someone else. They have an ability to do that. And then I was looking at government that way. Whoa, well, government is providing services for sure. It provides courts, road servicing, military, police, very important things for society. But these service providers have special privileges because we haven't explicitly consented to it in the same way that you would consent to a service provider where you have the contract out and you've mutually agreed upon it. Some would say that we have actually consented to government through like birth certificates and things like that. I don't know enough to comment. But the point is, you're not sitting down with the service provider and saying like, this is what I agree to. If we are agreeing, it's not like a informed consent process and mutually agreed upon. So I'm harping on this because you end up in a situation with implied consent. And that's where the rub happens. When you have implied consent, you have the ability for tyranny, basically, where one group of people can do things that you didn't agree to. And this even occurs, dare I say it, in democracy. Like we tout democracy as this amazing thing. There's a difference between compulsory democracy and a voluntary democracy. Compulsory democracy is what we have now, and we're seeing it starkly after the 2024 election. Half the country feels disenfranchised because now things are going to be imposed on them that they didn't want, whereas the other half says, great. Is that a great system? I mean, even if you agree with the current regime that we're going to have that's going to be better, is it morally acceptable to impose something on other people? Is a compulsory democracy good? I would say it's a form of tyranny. It's literally the majority imposing its will on the minority. And some people say that's better than a monarchy. I don't know what's better. Like Hans Hermann Hoppe wrote a book, I think it's called Democracy, the God That Failed or something, where he compares democracy to monarchy in some interesting analyses. But in any event, you're talking about tyranny. So what's the alternative to that? The alternative, and by the way, your audience is probably asking, well, what would we do with the roads? What would we do with the military? I go through that in the book. You get into exercises of theoretical economics, and basically a free market could handle these things. Is it going to be good? Maybe not. Is it good now? No. So you end up talking about the lesser of two evils, what's relatively less bad. But the point is that when you have demand in a marketplace, there's a financial incentive for suppliers to come in, no matter what that thing they're supplying is. And in a free market, the incentives are properly aligned. Whereas with government, with government, you end up with like a Department of Education, for example, that's doing a bad job with education. And then they could say, yeah, the education's not great in this country. Give us more money. It's like a complete perverse incentive. Sometimes when you do worse, you can get more money in a free market. No, you go out of business if you do a bad job. Point being, there's a way to explain all this stuff. And you end up in what's known as voluntarism, where you get rid of all compulsory government and every service that government provides could be provided in a free market. You end up with no compulsory political monopoly, because that's what we currently have, a political monopoly. And the Great Reset is an example where society is being steered toward more government, more international collaboration between governments, and more centralization of power, which is, to me, a very dangerous thing.
I'm just a weird guy. I just can't turn it off. So when I started hearing, and you talked about it in the book, and I loved that you talked about it, similar to Upside Down Thinking. When I came across Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff, it was a similar kind of sensation that I felt when you brought up stakeholder capitalism, right? And the way they changed this one word because it still sounds good, right? And you're like, it's not really the same, because it's not an allegiance to shareholder capitalism, or the owners of the company and the customers of the company. Stakeholder capitalism is, well, wait a minute, you didn't build those roads, right? Or everybody has a stake in this thing. And you go, these aren't the same things anymore. And I love that you dove deep into those conversations.
Yeah, so this is in the Reset book. And so the Great Reset, if your audience isn't familiar with it, just to explain, because some people have heard the term and they're like, oh, this is some conspiracy theory. It's actually an explicit pronouncement by the World Economic Forum. It started off with Klaus Schwab, who was the executive chairman of the World Economic Forum, one of the most powerful organizations.
The book is available on Amazon, by the way. COVID-19, The Great Reset. Like, you can go get it. I had an old business partner that bought it and put it in his coffee shop. Literally, as a joke. Yeah.
COVID-19, The Great Reset. You can buy this book written by Klaus Schwab, but he announced it with then Prince Charles before the book was published. So these are powerful people saying, COVID's here, it's time for a great reset. And then people, if you talked about it back then, you were a conspiracy theorist, because the book is using very benevolent language. Like, this is all to make society better. COVID's challenging, yes, but we're going to make society a better place for all these reasons. So I said, look, let me break this down, because we're being steered in a very dangerous direction, and it's being positioned in flowery benevolent language. And let's break it down into simple language. Like, what are they actually saying? So I broke it down into 6 categories of the ways in which they are steering society, or at least want to, even though in their books, because there are multiple books actually, they don't say it this way. And I break it down into culture, politics, economics, environment, i.e. climate and CO2 in particular, technology and metaphysics. That those are the broad categories in which they want to steer society. And what you're talking about is the economics part, where, I mean, as a person who's anti-government and pro-voluntarism, where everything should be voluntary, and therefore pro-capitalism, voluntary exchanges in the marketplace, whereas under the current way we do capitalism, it's not true capitalism. You have governments intervening and getting to steer things, and they say it's still capitalism. It's actually not. I mean, one of my favorite quotes, and I quoted in Liberty and Medicine, I think, maybe Reset, I'm not sure. When buying and selling are controlled by legislation, the first things to be bought and sold are legislators. When buying and selling are controlled by legislation, the first things to be bought are legislators. So if you have the economy controlled in any way, even if it's light control, you can buy those people and then steer the market in your favor. So you end up with a problem of cronyism, effectively. And then enter stakeholder capitalism. So first of all, you put anything in front of the word capitalism, to me, it's a misnomer, because capitalism means free and voluntary exchanges without any outside influences. This again gets to the Austrian School of Economics. Check out Mises.org, mises.org. Then you introduce stakeholder capitalism. Like, what does that even mean? Who are the stakeholders? It's this very vague term which allows some people to steer the economy in the way that they feel is best, even though it sounds really nice, because all the stakeholders should have a say, is what Klaus Schwab is talking about. And that was one of the big themes in the book, whether it's stakeholder capitalism or something else, whether it's we should basically restrict our consumption to save the planet because there's too much CO2. It's always something that sounds really nice and appeals to the notion of compassion and feels good. But just because something feels good internally doesn't mean that it's going to be a policy that has positive changes in the world. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. And that's what this is about with regard to the Great Reset, but I think so many things in the world where we get, our psyche gets hijacked and we're told it's for the greater good, it's for the collective, and therefore you're a good person by following this. When in reality, there's a deception here. It can be a wolf in sheep's clothing.
What is your perspective then now on medicine and where we are with that? And, you know, I had just mentioned earlier that I had gone to Joe Dispenza's 7-day meditation retreat. There's nothing, you're not doing anything. Yeah, I mean, literally, you're not doing anything. You're closing your eyes and listening to music, like literally not doing anything. And I'm watching people with MS. Or if we do a walking meditation, I watched them get wheeled out on a wheelchair with the helper. And then during the meditation, stand up and start walking, pushing their wheelchair. And then when the meditation finishes, they tap back into that old identity and sit back down in the wheelchair and get wheeled inside by the helper. And there's a weird moment of a double take where you're like, hey, what, Jessica, I just saw you pushing the words, going back to that, right? Like, you dive into a lot of these different things and you circle back throughout all 7 books into consciousness. We talked about this quite a few times. What's your take on medicine now after kind of going through all of this?
I think it's the allopathic system, as I say in the book, in Upside Down Medicine, is based on reductionism, and it's based on treating symptoms rather than looking at the root cause. And that leads us to a system that's not actually healing people often. It's just putting Band-Aids on, which can be useful in emergencies, and I think there is a place for the allopathic approach. The problem is that it's become the general rule for how to approach anything. Anytime someone's sick, they use this like shotgun approach. And the reductionism is in the belief that everything is fundamentally material, which I've talked about in all my books, like you say, that if there's this element of consciousness that underlies the material, and that the human being is actually not a physical entity even, or that the human being at its core is a soul or a consciousness that's embodying a physical vesicle, you've got to get that straight before you start treating a human. Like, you need to know what a human being is first and foremost. So I think before I get into like these miracles that are super important with consciousness that Joe Dispenza works on, I want to approach the allopathic, some of the more conventional allopathic ideas, which are reductionistic, that it loves to look at germs because it fits the model so well that there's this invisible enemy that makes you sick. And if we give you this one pill, you can kill the enemy and then you're good. It appeals to the reductionism versus, well, maybe there's many other forces that explain why people get sick. And the germ theory of disease, actually, let me preface this by saying, before I wrote this book on medicine, when I came across the ideas, I was super resistant to it. I'm like, this can't be true. I don't know about it, but I looked into it more and more, and like doctors are out there speaking. I mean, it is not good for your career. Dr. Andrew Kaufman, Dr. Thomas Cowan, Mark and Sam Bailey in New Zealand, and many others who are speaking out. Michael Yeadon, who's a VP at Pfizer, is now asking questions about the virus. Like some really prominent people asking questions. I said, I've got to look at this. So what is the germ theory of disease? It's the idea that microbes can make you sick. They can launch attacks on healthy tissue, basically. And I want to divide this into two categories. The first category is microbes that there really isn't a controversy about their existence versus the one microbe where there is a controversy, which is virus. So the first category, let's say bacteria, fungi, parasites, these are things that will appear in large quantities when a person is sick with symptoms. The question is, do we run into affirming the consequent as a logical fallacy to explain causality? It's like saying that we see firefighters at the scene of a fire, therefore firefighters caused the fire. Is that always true? When we see a quote-unquote infection, there are a lot of bacteria, person's super sick, and we know that bacteria can emit endotoxins, for example. But are the bacteria the root cause of the illness? Or are the bacteria there because they are saprophytic organisms, meaning they help to break down dead and dying tissue, and there's an underlying toxicity in the body, and the bacteria are actually there to help you because you are so toxic? Same thing could be said about fungi and parasites, that they have unique abilities, these different microbes, to symbiotically help you get rid of stuff. That's mind-blowing to think about. And I actually had an interview last night. I want to preempt this because he asked a great question. He goes, interesting stuff, Mark, but like my wife had some chicken and she got salmonella poisoning, so we know it was bacterial. And I said, well, there were a lot of certain types of bacteria there in the food that you found, but why were the bacteria there? Maybe the food had poison in it. Maybe it was just rancid food and there were a lot of bacteria, and we called it salmonella. And he said, oh, I hadn't thought about it. So we always run into issues of causality with this stuff, and that's why I'm glad we talked about affirming the consequent before. We get stuck in the model. It rained. The bacteria caused disease. The virus exists, so forth. But there are these postulates that you could use and that I think should be used more. I mean, there are many papers that claim to use these postulates, but we can talk about the issues with it. To logically show that a germ causes disease, this should be really simple to exhibit. And they're known as Koch's postulates and then Rivers' postulates. The first one of Koch's postulates is a big problem for bacteria because it says that, again, this is a method of logic to show that a germ causes disease. That the germ should be present only in sick people, but not healthy people. Ooh, that's a big problem for so many bacteria like E. coli, a bunch of others. They do appear in healthy people, so that means there must be some other factor by definition when they appear in large quantities and they co-occur with certain symptoms. But then there are other postulates where basically you introduce this isolated microbe into a healthy person, see if it causes symptoms, and then re-isolate it. You want to demonstrate contagion. And as I talk about in the book, in It's Upside Down Medicine, the way the contagion studies are done is really outrageous because you would think it would be so simple to demonstrate, put a sick person with a bunch of healthy people and make them sick. There are a lot of failed contagion studies with the Spanish flu. We haven't even gotten to viruses. They were coughing in each other's faces.
I was going to ask you to specifically talk about that. That's one of the craziest, the people talking about the ways and the manner that they tried to demonstrate that this is contagious is, I am astounded that this is not talked about more. I mean, I can't even believe they found volunteers to do this study. Like, unbelievable. Thank you for bringing that up, because I was specifically going to be like, can you talk about the Spanish flu and what they tried to do to demonstrate some of this stuff?
Mind blowing. The most virulent, contagious, killing people microbe of all time, was they could not transmit it in a study. Milton Rosenau's study of the Spanish flu, where they were trying to demonstrate contagion and were unable to. They tried every way you could, injecting stuff into people, having sick people cough into healthy people's faces, and no one got sick. But I mean, you would just expect for all these diseases that are supposed to be contagious, that there would be a study where you had some sick organisms and then you put them together with healthy organisms and the healthy ones got sick. We're not even talking about isolating the microbe first. But that's not how it's done. These studies are done by taking unpurified fluids and injecting them into animals, and then the animal comes down with some symptoms, and you're like, we just proved contagion. First of all, we're going to get into this. They don't have purified samples when they're talking about viruses that they're injecting. There's other stuff in there by definition because of the way they run their studies. But they're injecting this stuff into like the brain of an animal or the trachea, and then what do you know? The animal gets sick. I mean, they aren't running controls, at least in the studies that I've seen and the ones that the doctors I've talked to have presented. They're not running controls where they inject water into the animal's brain to see if that does it, or if you inject orange juice or other fluids. Like, there might be something about the act of injecting this stuff in a completely unnatural way, by the way. Like, that's not how COVID was allegedly being transmitted. It's you walk by someone and you could die from COVID because something in the air, it's like that fragile that they're talking about contagion. Why, if it's that contagious, are you injecting these unpurified fluids into animals, and then some of them get sick with somewhat similar symptoms, and you say, look, we proved contagion? Mind-blowing stuff. I've talked to some doctors about this. I'm remembering one doctor in particular, totally brilliant. He was like, yeah, just, these are old studies on the contagion. I really never went back to look at how those were conducted. It's like, it's just part of the ethos that this was established long ago. Obviously, contagion's real. Okay, so I talked about bacteria and these and parasites and fungi as question marks, right? I don't know for sure, but I'm talking to doctors who are like studying this and saying, we haven't seen any evidence that these things cause disease. We're looking, please show us. And where it gets me before I go on is, if there were evidence for this, I would expect like books and books full of well-controlled studies. Maybe there are some out there that I haven't seen, but like, why should there just be one or two? Shouldn't there be binders on each bacterium, each parasite, each fungus that shows this stuff? And like, maybe I said, maybe they will emerge, but let's see it using logic to show that this thing causes disease, not that it just co-occurs. Okay, that brings us to viruses. Again, I was super resistant to this because I remember hearing in early 2020, there were some people questioning the jab. Some people were questioning whether COVID was as serious as people said. And those were the conspiracy theorists. And then you had the fringe. Dr. Andrew Kaufman getting on Brian Rose's podcast saying, yeah, viruses don't exist. There's no SARS-CoV-2. And then Tom Cowan and Mark and Sam Bailey and others started to echo that. And I didn't have enough knowledge to even evaluate what they were saying. But a lot of people I respected said, this no virus thing is a psyop. It is here designed to misdirect people who are legitimately questioning other things in health. By the way, I'm getting this with the cosmology stuff too. Mark, you're falling for a psyop that's distracting from other things. So I'm like, am I I'm worried about it before I write these books. I don't want to contribute to a psyop and fall prey to it. So I've got to have really good evidence. And I feel like the logic that I talk about in the books warrants a book on this stuff, including the virus thing. Because what I didn't realize was that when Andrew Kaufman was speaking about viruses in early 2020, it wasn't just that this questioning of viruses popped up with COVID. This came up earlier with HIV/AIDS in the early 80s and 90s with the Perth Group. Anyone can go to theperthgroup.com. Go ahead.
And it's the same leadership and the same hammer that came down. I can't stress that enough. We're talking about the same experts, right? My mother was a nurse during this, and she was one of the few nurses that would still work with patients with HIV and AIDS when this happened, because no one knew how it was contagious. How is it transmitting? They didn't know. It was the end of the world. People, the HIPAA laws were literally made because if it was on your chart, nurses wouldn't treat you. And my mother was one of the few people that were like, I have a Hippocratic oath. I have to do this. Like, I'm gonna work with them anyway, right? People don't even know that, right? Sorry, I cut you off again, but it's the same people.
I'm glad you emphasized that Fauci was key in HIV/AIDS, and this was talked about by Kerry Mullis, inventor of the PCR test, Nobel laureate. He wrote about this in his autobiography. RFK Jr. writes about it in the Real Anthony Fauci. And to be super clear, before people get confused, there's no debate that people get sick and die. The question is what causes it. So to question the existence of viruses is not to question all the people that have been sick and have had tragic deaths. So that's not it. We're trying to get to the root cause here so that doesn't happen anymore. It's the opposite of what many people say. It's like you're just denying science. No. We're looking back at the science. So I didn't realize that history existed, that there was a group, the Perth group, it was small, that was questioning this, and they wrote a book. They wrote a very lengthy paper called HIV, a Virus Like No Other, which is available at theperthgroup.com. Anyone reading that will say, okay, this is a matter of science. Agree with it or not. This isn't just people, conspiracy theorists saying, I don't believe the virus. Like, this is super technical. But then I didn't realize that a virus, as a replication-competent intracellular parasite that's based on genetics, that was not conceived until the early 1950s. So the light bulb went off. We're not that far away. Like, it's possible that maybe they got it wrong because there's a gap in our understanding. And we haven't had that many major viruses that the whole world is focused on. HIV/AIDS was a big one, but that was not that long after the early stuff in the 50s. And then COVID came around. So, okay, I can make a logical argument how they could be so wrong. But it was the 1953 Watson and Crick paper on the double helix structure of DNA was essential. And I learned about this from Stefan Lanka, who was a mainstream virologist, who now speaks publicly about the fact that no virus has ever been isolated. Very outspoken. That was wild when I learned about Stefan Lanka, Lanka. Whoa. Okay, and so he says, in 1953, all of a sudden there was a genetic explanation for why people are getting sick, because prior to that, it was not well understood. They were trying to understand illness. So like Louis Pasteur studying rabies, he sees symptoms and he says, there must be some agent that I can't see. It's beyond our technology that's making them sick, that's going from one person to another. And so people were using this term virus, but actually hadn't come up with a model for it beyond, some people called it a poison, like the term eos in Greek meant poison, and that was the root of virus. So the term's been around for a long time, but it wasn't until the early 50s that it had this specific definition. The thing that gets inside your cell and is this parasite. So that takes us to the 1954 study of, actually one more thing I want to mention is the bacteriophage. This is really essential to the belief in viruses. The bacteriophage is believed to be a virus-like particle that infects bacteria. And in the late 1960s, there was a Nobel Prize awarded for it. So this gave a framework for, okay, we've got genetics, we've got something that's infecting bacteria, maybe there's something that's infecting other host cells of non-bacterial things. Now, if you talk to some people, like the virus questioners, they'll say, actually, bacteriophages exist, but to call them parasites is the wrong thing, is that actually these things do show up, but it's when bacteria are stressed. So they're not actually parasites. But in any event, the bacteriophage plus genetics of Watson and Crick gave a framework for maybe there's this genetic parasite. And then the question becomes, how do we detect it? That takes us to 1954, Enders and Peebles study. Enders was a Nobel Prize winner, so very prominent guy. And the word isolation traditionally means to separate one thing from another. Separate one thing from others. Why is this so important? Because in scientific studies, you need an independent variable, meaning you need to have the thing that you're going to introduce into the study to see if it does the thing you think it's going to do. So if you think a virus is going to cause disease or cause cells to break down, you'd want to have just a virus by itself. You wouldn't want to have other things there because maybe those other things are causing cells to break down. You run into affirming the consequent if you don't have an independent variable, because maybe it's not that it rained last night. Maybe there was something else that caused the grass to be wet. So in their study, which is now the gold standard, 1954, they took fluids from a sick person. They were looking at measles. So someone who had these symptoms. And they assumed a virus was in the sample that they took from sick people. And often in these studies, they'll filter those fluids. But it's a sample from a sick person, and they put it into a soup of material called a cell culture. And this soup has a lot of things in it, like antibiotics and monkey kidney cells and a lot of other things. And depending on the study, there might be different amounts. But there's a whole bunch of stuff in this soup. When you add fluids from the sick person into the soup, the scientists find sometimes that cells break down in the soup. And they say, cells broke down, therefore there was a virus. We have isolated a virus. That's what they mean by isolation. This is big problems because now any analysis that they do afterwards, is based on an unpurified sample that you don't even know contains a virus, because maybe something else in the person's bodily fluids caused cells to break down, or maybe something in the sample in the cell culture itself, the antibiotics or other things, cause cells to break down without even an alleged virus. So we end up here with a reification fallacy, basically a unicorn that no one has shown to exist, and we are using other data to reify the existence of this unicorn. So an example, they will look under an electron microscope, which wasn't conceived until the 1930s, by the way. So anyone who was talking about a virus as this entity wasn't able to see it. But using an electron microscope, you have to tamper with the sample, basically, in order to see things properly. So you end up with something that is actually dead and static in the image. That's a problem, because if you want to prove a virus, really, I would love to see a moving thing that's living, because it's supposed to get inside the host cell and then exit it. So some people would say you can only detect a virus inside a cell, because it's a parasite. No, because it has to get in the host cell and has to leave, so you should be able to capture it. That's an excuse people make. It's like you could never isolate it by itself, Mark. That's impossible. That's very convenient to say. So electron microscope, you're looking at something that's static and not living. You want to see something that is moving and alive. So they see something under the electron microscope and infer this thing must be the virus, because we see it very often when this disease occurs. Well, maybe it has to do with the method, and maybe when people are sick with certain symptoms, their body produces certain things that will come up all the time, and you might see that very often under an electron microscope. But in any event, you're making all kinds of inferences to point an arrow at something and say this is the thing. In a laboratory setting, by the way, you're not even looking at it in the body. So you're making so many inferences that this is the virus that's causing all this stuff. Okay. Also, genomics. This is a really big thing, because a virus should be defined by its genetic sequence. But if you don't have a purified sample of just a virus by itself, how do you know that the sequencing methodologies that are being run in these complex mathematical models, by the way, using computers, and like who knows what's actually going on. But in any event, you would want to have a sample of just the virus to know that those nucleotides are just from the virus, just like to be logical about it. If you have other things in there, then you might be picking up genetic sequences that are not from the virus. So then the genome that you think is from a virus actually might not be viral. There are even other questions that I would recommend your audience look at Dr. Tom Cowan's work. He's questioning genomics even, looking at the foundations of the Watson and Crick study in 1953. I would like to look at this more myself, but I didn't realize the human genome hasn't been fully done yet. Like there are still some holes in it. And I've been probing around, like getting AI to even admit this stuff, that even with a virus or there's been no organism where the entire genome has been found allegedly. And the excuse is like, we've mostly done it, and maybe there's a few holes. Just bookmark this as something that needs to be looked into. I don't know for sure with this stuff, but that would be a big problem for virology too, because if you're basing something off a virus that's supposed to be defined by its genome, you need the entire thing. Like, don't tell me one nucleotide's missing, just like all swans are white. No. We want the whole thing if we're going to detect that whole thing elsewhere. But in any event, even if you did have a whole genome that you could have of an organism, you need to have a purified sample. So anytime the word viral is put in front of something, viral protein, viral antigen, viral antibody, how do you know it's associated with the virus? You don't, ever. So this means if you don't have a virus by itself, meaning you don't have an independent variable, you can't have a proper control done, because the control is the absence of the independent variable. And if you don't have an independent variable, how can you even know what control to run? You cannot run the scientific method. Therefore, virology becomes a pseudoscience by definition. It becomes a field that is based on a particle that has not been established using the scientific method. And then that's just identifying the particle itself. The next step is you need to show that it causes disease and goes from one person to the next. So that's where you run into problems with these contagion studies where they have an unpurified sample. They say it's viral, or they say in the vaccine they have viral stuff in it. Well, really, they have an unpurified sample that they're calling viral using the reification fallacy, and then they might inject it into a monkey or something and say we've caused disease. So it ends up as a house of cards.
Like a big house of cards. I think, there's going to be a lot of books, a lot more books written on the last 4 years, in particular. And further back, of course, but in terms of, it just sounds to me like in a shocking amount of fields, science is anything but when you really dive deep into these topics. And that's what you got me so hooked with, because these are supposed to be the guys. These are supposed to be the guys that are the scientists. And it's like, you're not even following your own scientific method so often because it's conventional wisdom in that field, right? So what's your take then on this whole conversation? We briefly talked about it with contact, which I think relates to the cosmos. What's your take on what's going on here, or what's your opinion? But like I said, I'm not the aliens guy. I'm fascinated as much as any human should be, right? In terms of like the people that blow this off entirely, I don't think grasp. Like, I think it's the equivalent of people that blow off AI, for example. And when you have like, I think it was either Sundar Pichai or I think it was him or Larry Page. One of the Google guys said AGI, General Artificial Intelligence, is the equivalent of man discovering fire. You're like, wait a minute, what? You want to say that again for me? And you're like, you can't ignore that, right? That's not, he didn't say like, oh, it's Internet 3.0, right? It's like, he's like, this is going to change things fundamentally. In that regard, I think contact is the same way. It will change things. Now, by the way, disclosure's already done. That's been done for 50 years or 20 years. They've openly been saying that. They're having hearings. They all agree that this is actually happening. Now, what is happening is the question. Like because you've really taken time to deep dive into this and research, not writing for sensational, to be sensational, I should say. What's going on with this contact and UAP UFO situation, in your opinion?
Well, I'm writing about it for the very reason you said, that this is a topic you can't ignore. It's too foundational to our civilization to ignore it. So with that preface, I would say that I don't fully understand what's happening, especially with disclosure, because the government's history, and I have a chapter on this in the book, An End to Upside Down Contact, is one of non-transparency. I mean, it's one of deception and hiding the truth. So anytime the government's coming out with a narrative, I'm just asking, are there some truths in this? Are they trying to get us to believe something for some reason? Are they trying to cover up their past lies in some way? So the hearings to me are just confusing. And I think that they are not talking about consciousness nearly enough, because really this gets down to the phenomena like abduction and the near-death experiences. You've got to get metaphysical with this, and often they're not going there. So it makes me a little bit worried that they're so focused on the physical aspects with it. I simply don't know where this is going to go, because to me it ultimately ties back to what are the true origins of humanity, and what's our real history, and how are these beings, and I use these beings in capital letters almost, because or some people would use them in capital letters to say that it's a uniform monolithic thing. I wouldn't. I would say there are probably many species that have different interests and have had different impacts on our civilization. So this stuff is so complex. It's like, which species have which interests and for how long, and are they even working with governments with this? Are they steering the narrative? Which ones are benevolent? Which ones aren't? To me, I just think we're not alone. And like I say in the book, I don't think they're all necessarily benevolent. I think some are probably nefarious. I think this has been going on for a long time, and they're definitely affecting our civilization in some way. And you've got to incorporate consciousness. It's not just physical. Like, those are some of the key points in my book. So those things I feel pretty comfortable with. Beyond that, it's just a confusing mess.
I mean, there's things that you talk about in that book, like implants, and you're naming names and specific doctors, right? A lot of these, none of these are at the press club hearings that they're having, and they have been having since I think 99 or 2001, right? So you're like, why are none of these? Are they totally bogus, and that's why, and they've already been disproven, but you just want to give them a fair chance, so you feel the need to put them in your books? Or like, why are they just being blatantly ignored?
Great question. I don't know. I mean, it might just be too hard for people to believe, too much to handle. these hearings they're so focused on just crafts in the sky and the movements, and it's like just a hot topic culturally. Whereas you talk about like Dr. Roger Leir writing his book, The Aliens and the Scalpel, talking about the surgeries he performed to remove weird things from people that had similar
By the way,
characteristics.
if this guy's crazy and became a physician, I think that enough shows, like, is he on SSRIs? What's going on here to make him just write this book if he's just making it up? You know, like that's clinically psychotic behavior if you just wrote that book and you're making that up, right? Am I wrong when I say that? That's crazy.
Well, I mean,
right?
It's so.
But if he's serious, you're like, he's putting people under general anesthesia doing surgeries. You know, not all of them are alien based, so something's happening here, right?
Well, and he's got pictures in the book, and there were people there to witness the surgeries, pictures of the things he removed from people, and there are other doctors. So in Roger Leir's book, The Aliens and the Scalpel, he talks about this one case of an implant that started moving around when he tried to remove it as if it were intelligent. But then I quote in the book another doctor who was removing implants.
I don't know what just fell. Something just fell. My door. I have a key thing. Yo, sorry. I muted my mic so you couldn't hear that. I have a thing on my door. Yo, I just got full goosebumps. Bro, so I have a key thing on my door and I hang up my car keys in my door. My son and my wife didn't wake up. But that just fell. That was very loud. I wish my mic wasn't muted. Go ahead.
Okay,
sorry.
No worries. Yeah, it's weird things.
Wow, that freaked me out, man.
Yeah, and we're talking about a freaky
ahead.
topic of implants moving, evading surgeons.
This is what I'm talking about.
And there was another example, Whitley Strieber, he talked about attempts to remove an implant that he has that it was evading the surgeon. So 2 different surgeons trying to remove moving implants. I think I got that right. It's been a while since I looked at those passages, but yeah, I mean, that blew me away because it's not just one surgeon that's talking about this. Now, what the origin of these implants, like what's the origin? They could be government implants. There are a lot of things that we don't know about this stuff. There's also a book called The Hair of the Alien that I mentioned. That it's a wild story of this guy that had an alien encounter, and it was a sexual encounter, and there was hair left in his private region as a result, and he kept it and found Bill Chalker, who's a researcher, and they did forensic level analysis on this hair. I have questions now about genomics in general, but based on their analysis, they found some very strange properties of the hair. I mean, reading these books, it's incredible amount of effort and money and time that went into these analyses. I don't know for sure what's going on, but it's weird, and certainly there's not a lot of funding going towards these areas. And I know this a lot because I'm on the board of the Institute of Noetic Sciences, which has been around for about 50 years. And the organization studies phenomena scientifically, like energy healing and mind-matter interactions and mediumship, which is deceased energies communicating with the deceased, basically, lucid dreaming, all these kind of weird things, quote unquote paranormal, but doing it in a scientific manner. And I know what the funding environment is like for that sort of thing relative to any mainstream cause. So that's another thing with this stuff. A counter argument I've heard is like, Mark, if these things were real, then there would be a lot more scientific evidence to prove it. And it's sort of self-fulfilling argument. And I would say, yeah, there isn't as much scientific evidence in the way that you want it, but it's also not being funded. It's also dangerous to study these things. There are a lot of reasons, financially, sociologically, that keep people away from getting more evidence.
I mean, we're seeing that from anthropologists. We're seeing that from geologists. Those are, I'm not saying that the history of mankind is less important. I'm simply saying it's a little less dangerous when you're digging up rocks versus some of these things that we've talked about now, right? I mean, especially given the last couple years, right? Unbelievable. I know I only got a certain amount of time with you. I have to let you go here. I could keep going and ask more questions, but before I let you go, let me ask at least this. Is there, so you had explicitly wrote, I think it was Upside Down Living, that you didn't plan on going down this road. You didn't plan on even these individual topics. You've kind of written one and then felt led to write the next, and then felt led to write the next, and then kind of so on, and you write when you feel it, including the links to the books and the topics and what you're covering. It's a very much so you feel like you're being guided in this conversation or in this life to put this information out there. Is there a topic that you are covering currently that you are writing about now that we can expect in the future? Or
no, the way it works for me is that I end up just researching things that interest me, and then I get hooked on one particular theme. Sometimes I won't even know they're related to a theme. So when I was writing the Reset book, before I wrote the Reset book, I had spent a lot of time looking at politics and economics, as you know, but then I was looking at climate stuff. And I'm like, what's going on with that? Is that narrative true? Is it really extinction level stuff where we should restrict people's behavior on this basis? And then the cultural stuff, some you might call it woke, just like some of the trends that are out there. And then I realized, well, this is all related to the Great Reset, and it's related to what I refer to as leftism, which is distinct from liberalism. It's this much more extreme version, and I go through the psychology of that. So that's kind of just a microcosm of how these things work. I get hooked on various things, and then sometimes they congeal, and I say, oh my goodness, now I know what this book is. And when I write the book, it's usually very quick. It's like 2 weeks plus or minus, where I sit there with all my sources, and it's all cited and everything. But the writing process of actually typing things out is relatively quick. I mean, editing and everything takes months. And then reading the audiobook, it's usually a few months, but it's research first. And I'm in the phase now where I'm just researching a lot. I don't know if I'm ever going to write a book again. I mean, I always say this. I'm not sure if I'm going to write a book again. I'm definitely interested in a lot of things. I mean, my life has been it changed so much. I wrote the first book and ended Upside Down Thinking while I was still working. And then I decided to leave my firm. After I became a partner, I spent 10 years there and said, I'm going to leave because I need to pursue this other stuff. So that was a really hard decision in some ways. And then I wrote an End to Upside Down Living as I was transitioning out of the firm. And then the world shut down with COVID. And then I realized there was all this deception that I hadn't covered in thinking or living that I needed to cover. And I've written 5 more since then. But I just don't know where my life is going to go in a lot of areas. So I leave it open, basically, to see what's next. But before we go, there was a point that I do want to cover quickly. I think it's super important because we covered like the allopathic part of medicine and why we should question germ theory and consider other causes for illness. And like we've got to think about toxicity. There's so many toxins out there that don't get studied as much. There's electromagnetism, there's electricity, there are like energetic causes that we could think about when we start thinking about consciousness. But there are a lot of elements of healing and health that get into this Joe Dispenza realm that are just important to mention, because like what you're describing, there are many spontaneous healings that have been reported. Actually, the Institute of Noetic Sciences has a detailed annotated bibliography of spontaneous healings that destroys the mainstream paradigm. Like these things should never happen. And one example that I love to mention is Anita Morjani. She was dying of terminal cancer, had tumors all over her body, and went into a coma and had a near-death experience where her consciousness expanded, like many people describe, but she had these realizations in her consciousness that maybe like she was judging herself too harshly, and she had a reconciliation with her father who had deceased. So she came back in her body and her tumors disappeared, and the doctors didn't know what happened. I mean, these are cases that are just remarkable. And the last thing I'll say here, that because I mentioned a lot of them in the book that allopathic medicine has to incorporate to get away from the reductionism. But there's a field I mentioned in that book that I'm increasingly interested in. It's called German New Medicine, which is the first field that seems to bring a physical correlate to consciousness. And this was studied by Dr. Hammer in Germany in the late 70s and 80s, where he found that there is a brain lesion that can be seen on brain scans that corresponds to ailments in the organs of the body, which corresponds to a certain type of conflict shock, meaning some kind of emotional trauma. So basically Do you mean like that's like kind of like acupuncture type of thing? Not a totally different science, but I mean like just the way the energy centers of the body, the way they, and then the way they don't function properly causes I don't know if that has been studied, if we can tie it to Eastern medicine, for example, or the energy channels. So I don't know the mechanism. But the way that I've learned about it is that it's distinct from that, even though acupuncture and those things might have a relationship or might help. But it's basically there's a shock in the psyche. You can see a lesion in the brain, and it corresponds to an organ. This is every ailment you can think of. Cancer, MS, skin conditions, like you name it. And there's a website called learninggnm.com. GNM is short for German New Medicine. And there's a search function where you can go through you can search for any ailment and it tells you the German new medicine explanation for it, meaning that if you've looked at enough brain scans and seen enough of the correspondence with symptoms, you know the emotional shock people have been through. So you have a certain condition, you have a separation conflict that you're working through. This is wild stuff, because then it's a total reframing. It's not to say that you shouldn't consider the toxins and other physical issues, because that can help with the healing process, for example, but it brings consciousness at the center. And it has a physical correlate with the brain. And the last thing I'll say on it before you respond is, in many of the conditions, it depends on the condition. The healing phase follows the resolution of the conflict. It's a reversal of how you think about things typically. Usually when you're sick with symptoms, I'm sick. But often in German new medicine, when you're sick, it means you've resolved the conflict and your body's flushing out all the stuff that was built up when you were conflict active.
So then fighting the sickness would make it worse, which would be like the current paradigm. We're treating the symptoms. We're fighting what is actually flushing, which is actually healing you, which you've already healed. You're just manifesting it now. Buzzword. But
Yes.
Okay.
So, and it might mean there are different philosophies on this, because sometimes you do want to treat the symptoms. Sometimes the symptoms could be so bad that you die. So it really depends on the person's situation to work with the practitioner to bring in the right tools. But what you're describing is the correct reframing. That sometimes the best thing is for your body to flush things out on its own.
That's fascinating, because that would be, in theory, if you had enough scans of the brain, you would actually be able to determine at a certain point, like, this is the actual, most likely this is the type of trauma that took place, right? Whether it's like PTSD or sexual trauma, you'd have enough of it, you'd be able to go, look at the aggregate data. We know now, like, this is probably what happened. Did that happen? Oh, yes, this is what happened. Oh, this matters, right? That's a fascinating.
Yes. So learninggnm.com, German New Medicine. And this is what's happened, Quinton, after a few decades, is that there are enough brain scans. I mean, obviously, we'd love to see more research.
Oh, they've already done it. They're far along in this.
They've already done this. They're far along. They're German New Medicine.
I thought this was new.
I mean, it's newish,
wow.
But if you have a certain symptom, a German New Medicine practitioner instantly, you have this kind of conflict. This is what you're working through. And then the person says, oh, wow, I didn't think about that. That's what I have been dealing with. Oh, wow, I resolved that conflict. And then I had flu-like symptoms afterwards. Whoa, because I had a stink conflict. They're different types. And it relates even to certain types of psychological phenomena where they're called constellations, where you develop, because of certain types of conflict shocks, you develop personality traits that end up shielding you from it. So it's basically, there are 5 biological laws in German New Medicine, where it's a rethinking of all biology as it relates to the psyche. And so I think this is a new frontier that I mention it because I just feel like more people should be looking at it who are smart.
That's really cool. I'm definitely going to look into that. I had no idea. I thought you were talking about kind of like a theorized, type of thing. I didn't realize that they've been working on this for a minute. You said
very
this is
controversial.
From the 70s, though, right?
Well, it started in the late
Okay.
70s and 80s. I mean, super controversial for a lot of reasons, and I mean, it challenges the entire pharmaceutical paradigm. This is like fringe of the fringe in a lot of ways, because it's not saying that there's no physical cause, but it's really bringing you to consciousness. Because a lot of people, they'll say, even if you say no virus, they might get really stuck into the toxins narrative or the 5G, which is super important. But what the GNM perspective is often is that, I mean, certainly if you drink a bottle of arsenic or something, like, you're going to be poisoned, right? But they're not as focused on these things that you see more in like the biohacking space, because basically if you're clearing these conflicts or aware of the conflicts, then your body's just going to be much more capable of handling stuff. And sure, you want to be healthy in all the other ways too, but it brings you to the psyche first and foremost, rather than this is the toxin that you should be removing from your diet, or this is the vitamin that's going to help you. Those things from a German New Medicine perspective end up being a little bit further away from the root issue.
It's crazy because, I mean, think 2% of all disease is theorized to be genetic anyway. Whatever that means, I guess.
Whatever
Thanks,
that
Mark,
means.
for
Yeah.
ruining that. Yeah, right. Whatever that means. But that's, I mean, even if 2% is the thing, you're like, isn't like 50% of America have some type of chronic disorder? That would essentially mean almost all of that is psyche related. So I don't think that's casual. I mean, I don't think that's fringe of the. I think that is. Again, I'm about to interview Lynn not too long from now. Like I mean, I think back then it might have been considered fringe, but as of now, we now know, right? Kind of like NLP was fringe, But we now know certain postures affect certain hormones, which affect certain brain chemistry, which causes you to behave a certain way. Who would have guessed? I think there's a famous interview of Tony Robbins basically saying, like, I've been teaching this for 50 years, but Harvard just released a study last year, and let me tell you about it. Like, he's like, this isn't new, right? And I think that's what we're getting here with almost every one of these individual industries and topics, right? And conversations.
One more point I want to make. It's super important. I know we could go forever, but on the topic of genetics, it's it's like it's the fallback very often. So is virus. I don't know why you're sick. The doctor says, "Oh, it must be viral," as if it's this noble thing to say, which is kind of funny. But it's similar to genetics. Oh, it's this genetic thing. But we run into affirming the consequent again. Just because maybe you're in a lineage of people who've had similar things, couldn't it be that there are certain circumstances that reappear? Or let's say one person's traumatized in a certain way and then brings upon that similar trauma to the next generation because the trauma is not healed. So you end up with chains of psychological trauma that don't have actually a physical correlate in genetics per se. So anytime now I'm dealing with something in causality, I try to bring myself to just state what's observed rather than bring any causality into the language. Like instead of saying, oh, this person caught something, because caught, you're now in the connotation of contagion with a microbe, or like genetic. What's proper to say is like, what do we observe? The father had this condition for this many years, experienced all this in life, and get that data. The children have these things. Just observe it. Don't bring in genetic cause. Don't bring in the links. And then try to think of all possibilities. I think that's a good place to leave people.
100%. And I think you really highlighted, I did a terrible job representing it, but you highlighted a lot of the logical fallacies and you actually break them down before starting most of your arguments, which, like, if there was destiny, predestined, you're being guided by something, the fact that you started with living in order to lay the foundation. Yeah. And thinking, right, thinking and then followed it up with living, like, it was like, I mean, if destiny is a thing, it kind of seems like, you were led in that direction. Well, thank you for your time, Mark. Thank you for hopping on with me. Unbelievable. I know there's going to be a part 2, and I would steal more time if I had it from you, honestly.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. And again, I really appreciate the diligence you did before this interview and your willingness to talk about this stuff. Very brave and open-minded. And because you're doing this and others are doing it, it's how ideas get out there. I started off listening to podcasts, and that's why I am where I am today, arguably. That was maybe one of the first dominoes that got me here. So I just want to thank you.
Absolutely. Thrilled about it.